Boy, howdy, that was a trial. All right, so let me just. Okay. Um, so we've been having a bunch of technical difficulties today, as you might be able to tell, because 8:53, and it's taken me 20 minutes to figure out um, what's going on. So hopefully everything is okay now. We can talk about the film really, really briefly. I might not be able to give it the full half hour, but we can definitely go a little bit beyond 9 o'clock because I usually um, schedule about like half an hour to 40 minutes of these things because if people aren't really talking, then you don't want to hear me go on and on and on for an hour. But you can always ask me to do that if you want. But we can talk a little bit about Singing in the Rain. It's one of the movies that I definitely know by heart and from memory. So it's a really interesting. I've had a lot of time to think about it and sit on it for a while. I originally included it in the syllabus because I was like, oh yeah, Singing in the Rain is definitely a rom-com because it has the meet cute at the very beginning. Because there is like that happy romantic ending at the end. It seems very much in the vein of rom-coms because the central story. So basically, my criteria were the central story had to be romance and it had to be a comedy. And this movie actually meets both those criteria, but I don't know that it meets the criteria of what we might call a romantic comedy, which is really interesting because it's very rare that a movie is both those things and then maybe not romantic comedy. Once you start trying to define a genre, it gets really tricky and you go on for hours. And honestly, I don't want to get into it. I have no patience for a lot of it. I mean, I do, but I have no patience for explaining it to other people because I barely understand it myself. It's kind of the point. Genre is always changing, it's always evolving. But it's an interesting. I got a new swivel chair, and so now I'm swiveling all the time, and I need to stop. It's definitely an interesting idea of that happening because I can't think of a lot of other movies where it's Singing in the Rain is a very light movie and it's very there are movies that with romance as a central idea played straight, but not quite as funny as Singing in the Rain is. And I wonder if that's because the comedy of Singing in the Rain, it comes from satirizing Hollywood, or if that's because of its vaudeville roots, which is also a bit of a Hollywood thing. And it's also, like I said in the video, it's one of those movies that has a little bit of everything in it. It has all these different themes, or not themes, but I don't know, genres. Ooh, yikes. I'm going to do that so it's not crossing my shoulder. It has a little bit of comedy. Cosmo is vaudeville, obviously. It's a period piece. It's a musical, and it's a really, not a weird musical, but they like devote 20 minutes to a song and dance that has nothing to do with the main plot of the film. It's kind of all over the place, and yet it makes perfect sense. And that's kind of what makes it an amazing movie, is that it can contain all these things and it flows together seamlessly, even though there are a bunch of dance numbers that don't have any bearing on the plot. It's just, it's a plot-driven 20s showcase. It's actually a jukebox musical. Arthur Freed had written a bunch of those songs in the 20s, and because the 40s did a bunch of wartime musicals that were basically reviews, like Jerome, there was one that was all Jerome there was one, thank you Hannah, because that sequence is insane. There were a bunch of really popular, there was a Cole Porter sort of jukebox musical about his biography. And so Arthur Freed took a look at his own discography and was like, well, we can use my own discography because I own the rights to that, so we won't have to buy the rights to it. And then we can make a movie that around that. So that was the genesis of Singing in the Rain. It was a jukebox musical. So it really came from these roots of like this movie should not work like on any level. It should be a big old mess, and instead it's like a golden, crystal clear. It's one of those weird triumphs of Hollywood that it even exists. And I think a lot of that comes down to Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen being like, no, if we're attached to this, we're going to make it good. I'm sure that they had an idea of what they wanted to do before they joined the movie, but like I'm sure a lot of it was their ridiculous standards for everything else. And like, we're not going to put our names on this if it's not a piece of art. But it's also a nice it was definitely Gene Kelly's 105 degree fever, deciding that he made the right choice when he signed that contract. He actually had the fever for like 20 years, and the fever was making Debbie Reynolds cry. So the what was I going to say? I was on a rant. I was definitely on a rant, and I was getting to a point somewhere. So what's I'm sure a lot of it had to do with Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen. Don't apologize for making me laugh. But it's also weirdly, because the other movies that they made are very much more out there. And very like artistic, and very much like, this is a dance movie. This is going to push the boundaries of dance on cinema. This is art. American in Paris isn't even going to have like an ending. It's just going to be a 20-minute dance sequence. Like the Girls of Rockfort is just it's going to be all silent. Like Gene Kelly made a movie that was like all silent and it was all dancing. And so it was very much on the like art side of things. And Singing in the Rain is actually a really good balance of that sort of push for artistic value in musicals, and the commercial need for satisfying character relationships, for movie spectacle, for that balance. And I think that's why, American in Paris is a great movie, but it's not as satisfying to watch as Singing in the Rain because there are no character arcs in it. So I'm just going to go on and on about Singing in the Rain. I think a lot of my favorite movies are the ones that had a ridiculous premise and a thrilling weirdness and just somehow magically ended up in triumph. Agreed. Yeah, it's really insane. So that thread started with whether we want to call it a rom-com. I guess the next question could be if we want to call it a satire, or how we know it's a satire. I think it is. There's a scene at the very beginning, and Mallory, I know you didn't see it, but Don Lockwood is recounting his entire childhood and how he became a huge star, and it kind of sets up his relationship with Lena. And the interesting part is it's sort of told in this silent movie way, with Don Lockwood narrating it for his like radio audience, but they really did it intelligently in that Don is basically saying all the schlock. He was saying like, I was raised in the finest institutes, my motto was dignity, always dignity, and I was brought up on Chaucer and all the greats. And then you see him and Cosmo, sneaking into a bar and performing tap dancing for drunkards who would throw him coins. And then, they did the vaudeville circuit, and they made general fools of themselves. And they had like a really weird, annoying violin act. And so that the juxtaposition of what the identities that Hollywood creates for its audiences and the lies that it tells its audiences about the glitz and glamour of their world, and how constructed that is, I think is a really interesting thing that Singing in the Rain tries to tell about Hollywood itself. Even though it's referring to the 20s, it's sort of like Hollywood has always been this way. But it's also kind of setting up these characters to be more working class, or to seem more working class, and therefore more relatable than it's trying to make these really rich, extravagant characters very relatable. And part of that is in the fantasy romance that he has with Kathy, because Kathy is his fangirl and they end up falling in love. Because another aspect of this film is that Kathy is a fangirl. And I think that it's an interesting way of making the characters relatable through their background versus through their actions, or like their background informing their actions, which was I guess more new in the 50s. I think when I watch 1930s 1930s screwball comedies, you're aware of their class, obviously, and you're aware of we'll get to that in a second. They're sort of aware, you're sort of aware of their class. You're kind of assuming that they come from good families in some ways, or if they don't come from good families, but you don't, and you like they all have parents, but you don't really think about what they do for a living or how they work, and you don't really think of them as relatable. They're relatable in the sense that they're fun to watch. I guess they're relatable in the sense that they're having these adventures and you're kind of living through them for a bit, which makes sense because it's the 30s and it's the Great Depression. So you want to live through all these people experiencing the glamour, but you don't want to get a beer with them. And Singing in the Rain really presents these characters who are best friends, and you don't really have best friends in screwball comedies. You sort of, everyone's a potential enemy, I guess. So it's this weird transition. Singing in the Rain really does this weird transition of having the characters like each other. So I'm definitely curious as to how many films before Singing in the Rain did something like that with actors and acting, deconstructing the idea of the untouchable wealthy actor. I know that show business satires had definitely been done before, so it wasn't new to Broadway. And I also think that Anything Goes is something of a showbiz satire. And I'd have to look up. I don't know about Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I think that's a bit later. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is the year after, so it was definitely the era for satires. But sorry, I got a text. Okay. Yeah, so people starting off as wealthy actors. There's a movie called It's Love I'm After with Leslie Hunter, but he's also kind of a jerk, and so that's kind of he's sort of like full of himself, and he cheats on her all the time, I think. So that might be another good thing to look for. I think that's in the mid to late 30s. But yeah, I think a lot of the 50s was, I think a lot of that might just be like not pull yourself up by your bootstraps logic, but it's sort of this is attainable if you like put effort into it, because that's sort of what they were trying to sell to American families, that this sort of wealth is attainable and it's a relatable thing. To make the rags to riches story more relatable, or is it a quest to make it more relatable? Okay. Cool. I think I got that like in the middle of my little rant, so I wasn't sure if I'd answer that or not. Um, yeah, so it's definitely this idea of of why they want to satire Hollywood in that way and why that's the right idea to do it, because it's making it more relatable and it makes Hollywood seem more fun, I guess. Because I guess they were worried that people would go to TV instead. And so like if they put out this movie that's like there's no place like Hollywood, then people would still like the movies. Let me see if I think there were some other things I wanted to talk about. Let me get my handy dandy notebook. Because there was that fear of TV. Class. Oh my gosh. Well, we did kind of cover Class, but it's really interesting because I was thinking at first when I was filming the video, I was just like, oh, like Dawn's class versus Kathy's class versus Cosmo's class, because Cosmo is right where Dawn is. He's right there on the set. But he acts like he's poorer than Dawn is. Although I think technically when they do the good morning, I think that's supposed to be Cosmo's place, maybe, or maybe they're having dinner at Dawn's place. I don't know. But Cosmo is pretty rich and he still has this like I'm a poor schmuck mentality. And he carries that throughout the movie, and it kind of helps him be this like wisecracking sidekick, because you can't really be a wise ass if you have millions to spare, I guess, or you can, but people don't like you as much, I guess. But Don kind of embraces his wealth in a way, even though he comes from the same place that Cosmo did, but he's a front facing person, because people know who he is and he's on screen all the time and he gets recognized. He sort of has to adopt this air of dignity, I guess. And then Kathy is sort of the ingenue who sort of starts out in the place that Cosmo and Dawn started out a couple of years ago, and then like through the help of Cosmo and Dawn, she kind of ascends to stardom, and gets a Hollywood ending. But Lena starts off super rich, and she's kind of noted for how extravagant she is, the things that she wears, that huge pink coat, and she's just like lavish all the time. She shows off her wealth all the time, and then to counteract that, she acts, or like her voice betrays her like lowest status in society. Even though Dawn and Cosmo are kind of from the same status, but because they don't sound like Lena, they're considered more sane. They're considered more reasonable people. And so that contrast of, you should ascend from middle class to upper class, or you should ascend from these, lower classes, and you can still attain the stardom, but you can't be from the lowest class. You still need to know English. You still need to know grammar. You still need to pronounce things correctly. You can't be an idiot. And the idea there is that she's not really well educated. And that's definitely a class thing. Education is 100% a class thing. So I'm not sure that they were like intending to make that point. I think they really I think the idea of the joke, and that what makes it really funny, is that contrast between how much wealth she displays and like how glamorous she seems. And then underneath that, she's just a terror, and in a lot of senses of the word. And so it's this idea of, oh, you can be rich, but don't be too rich. And you can be lower class, but don't be too lower class. There's still like an out circle. There's like this thinly, this like not widely defined. This it's the opposite of widely defined, but I don't want to say thinly. It's this 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 narrowly defined idea of like what is acceptable, what is like the right way to be, and like what will society accept. And this movie really highlights that very well. But we're not talking about rom-coms anymore. This isn't really a rom-com chat, I guess. I just find that like so much of this film was fascinating, and I love this film. Like I know every line of this film, but once I started kind of like looking into like why is this considered humor, like what are the things that really stand out about this film, I'm just like, oh no, oh no, this film is really conservative. I don't know that it's that conservative, but it definitely came out of the 50s. It definitely came out of the late 40s and early 50s. And I think the way that it reflects those things is very interesting. And like Hannah said, being a leading man means you have to enact a certain class. So it's there's a lot to unpack there. And I guess in terms of rom-coms, so the next movie that we're watching is I'm going to say it's a modern movie. It came out 16 years ago, but like considering what we've been watching, it's a modern movie. The actors are still alive, so it's modern. That's my metric. I don't know about yours, but it's a more modern movie, and it's a satire about mid-century courtship, which is why I paired them together. The other movie I was thinking about showing when I thought I was going to have more than 4 weeks time was I think, was it like 1956? It's like a mid-50s movie starring Frank Sinatra called The Tender Trap, which is also with Debbie Reynolds. It is one of the most densely sexist things I have ever watched in my entire life. It's Frank Sinatra as this bachelor who doesn't want to get tied down by anyone, and he meets Debbie Reynolds, who is obsessed with marriage, and she's like the young ingenue who is going to star in his new show, and they fall in love, but like she literally cannot stop talking about marriage. It's the only thing she ever wants out of this entire life, and she won't date him if he won't commit to her. And he's like, lady, I've got a bachelor pad. Like, have you seen my apartment in the city? I am Donald Draper. Please go away. And like he ends up falling in love with her, and that's why it's called The Tender Trap, because there is a song that goes along with it, and it's like love is the tender trap, so she will trap you. And it's a gross movie. I've seen it like Nathan from Guys and Dolls. I love Nathan. I think it's because I wanted to be Adelaide so bad. I memorize all of Adelaide's lyrics, and like I think I like Nathan because I need a Nathan to do some of the duets, and that's the only reason I like Nathan is like my scene partner, so I like Nathan. It's a little bit the same character. Because the character in Tender Trap is worse than Nathan. Way worse. Well, because Nathan, it's up in the air because Nathan strings Adelaide along for 14 years, but he's pretty committed to her. So he's not really doing her right, but like he's also like in love with very, very much in love with Adelaide. He just has like a different list of priorities. Yes, correct. Sky Masterson offsets him. But this character in the movie is just like a cad. He just straight up, he's like, I'm a cad and I enjoy being a cad. And like, why are you worried about your wife? What you should do is come live with me in the city for a while, and we will get you someone to hook up with so you can leave your wife. That's literally what the first 30 minutes of the movie is about. So it's uh yeah, he full commits. It's 100% commitment from him. So I was gonna show that movie because I weirdly watch it all the time, and it's a bad movie, but I love it. And it's one of those things where it's just like watching a train wreck, honestly. Like, I cannot, every time I watch it, I cannot believe how sexist it is. It's insane. No one should ever see it, but I thought it would be interesting to watch it in the class because it is this representation of mid 50s values and courtship, and like the way that like men, that like it displayed the way that like men and women interacted in that era, or like the way that they were supposed to interact. And I think Singing in the Rain is the better movie, and I think I think it also brings up interesting things about defining rom-coms in the 50s. But Down with Love also pairs with this movie called The Tender Trap. And that is sort of satirizing the sort of swinging bachelor of the 50s, and the sort of battle of sexes, or battle of wills that happens in those sort of convoluted mid-century, like Doris Day, Rock Hudson kind of things. But Singing in the Rain is a better movie, and I really don't like Doris Day. That's me being completely selfish, because if I were an actual professor doing this for an actual academy, I might just have to suck it up and watch some Doris Day for the benefit of the class, but I'm not going to do that right now. So, thank you for joining me. Do you guys have any questions that you want me to answer, or that you have like opinions about the movie that you have? I can definitely do some quick answers or some quick whatever to wrap this up. But it is up to you guys, because otherwise we've been going for about half an hour, and I think we're probably good. I can wait a second and see if you guys come up with anything. But if not, I think I'm wondering if we actually did cover rom-coms, but that might just be what tonight is about. It might just be about whether or not it's a rom-com at all, and mid-century cads. Let me just final check anything. Kind of talked about how the romance is integrated with the comedy, because sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. I agree from a class perspective. So you said Singing in the Rain is ultimately a conservative film, and I agree from a class perspective. Oh, so there is kind of an OT3 ending, which is fairly liberal. So I actually find that the gender politics in the movie is pretty good. I don't know that I would call it an OT3 ending. Donald isn't really explicitly part of that pairing, but he is very much integrated into the relationship, and you can definitely read it that way if you want to. So the thing is, he's sort of part of the relationship. Oh yeah, that's fair. I was going to say, I don't read him as being into Kathy that much, so I don't really think of it as an OT3. But yeah, the dynamic between Don and Kathy is really progressive, because he listens to her and is invested in seeing her career grow in the way that she wants her career to grow. So he checks there's like a point. Yeah, that's true. He is into Dawn. I'm not even sure he's into anyone, let's be honest. So there is a point where they're talking about what they're gonna do. Oh, I think it's when Cosmo comes up with the idea of lip syncing for Lena, and he's like, "Oh well, Kathy will do it." And then Dawn turns to Kathy and is like, "Are you okay with this? This will hurt your career. Like, are you sure you want to do this?" And that just strikes me as such a forward-thinking, progressive way to treat a woman in a 1950s film, because like he cares about how he cares about her career, and like he asks it's okay. Like, he asks her if it's okay to do something, which is amazing. um uh and yeah, she's allowed to make her own decisions. She hangs out with Don and Cosmo, like, well, she's definitely not one of the guys, but she hangs out with them as if she's one of their friends, because Don is friends with Kathy and Kathy is friends with Don's friends. I think that gets back to the idea of Don and Cosmo being best friends and not really seeing that in cinema that much, up to that point. So you get this idea that they all just like hanging out together, and they're actually friends, and there's camaraderie there, and she's not just this object of she's not just this object of desire for him. She's a real person, whose opinion he trusts. And yeah, I mean, yeah, there's definitely a give and take there. The ending of the film isn't very kind to her. And yeah, absolutely. And that's how, so it's progression, like Mallory says, it's progression, but it feels like only to a point, which is honestly a lot of what you get in like liberal or more liberal films, even now. So everything you kind of get in movies is progression up to a point. You can look at a movie from the 30s and like, oh, this is pretty progressive up to a point for its era. I would say that it's progressive for the 50s, or just like having the representation of it in in the film, can be progressive, even if it's undercut a little bit. I think having those ideas in films is definitely more disruptive. Just presenting the idea of it in a film is more disruptive than, at the end, even if the end goes back to status quo, just giving people that question who might not have considered it before, is a big deal. But I totally understand why it's not enough, and why it needs to change, and like why it's not really considered like the most progressive or like the best. Well, I also think at the end, I think she's beholden to Don, but I think he's acknowledging all the work she did, and like how much he depends on her as much as she depends on him. So he's saying, you're the reason why I'm a good person, or like you're like, so you are like, you're my lucky star, is that like you're yeah, I guess. So it's on his terms. The trick at the end is like a really bad trick. And the fact that she's running away crying isn't great. But yeah, so the ending is complicated. I think up until the ending it's pretty good. That's fair. I think as a kid I really enjoyed it, but it's not great. It's definitely men in Hollywood pulling one over on a lady of success. So the optics of that aren't fantastic. But I still feel like I want to defend the movie in a lot of ways. But no, you're totally right that like there's a lot wrong with the way that happens. Yeah, I mean, I guess the really quick fix for that is to just get Kathy on board with doing that for Lena. And I feel like what happened is that they wanted a last minute spike of drama. So they're like, what can we do to make Kathy tell Don that she's never going to talk to him again? And so they came up with this idea in the last 3 minutes, and it makes no sense. So that just feels like a Hollywood machinations again, or machinations. And it is part of the film, but I don't think it's necessarily a view of the film as a whole. I don't think it should affect everything else that came before it, even though it's even though it's pretty bad. I don't think it should necessarily cast that large of a shadow on like the preceding hour and a half. Yeah, and I think we are. That's Hays Code stuff. Yeah, that's fair. Although I think it was a little. It wasn't completely out. It wasn't completely on the way out at that time. But it was starting to sort of get pushed. I think Singing in the Rain definitely follows that to a degree, but it was definitely that boundary was definitely starting to get pushed by the early to mid 50s. All right, so I think that was our discussion on Singing in the Rain. I'm pretty sure. I think we're good. We can continue the discussion, obviously, but I think I'm just going to get off the video chat. And I will see you on Sunday at 8:30 for Down with Love. And I will see you before that with the video that I will upload either Saturday or Sunday. I'm hoping Saturday. It might be Sunday. Just like last week, I said I'm hoping Tuesday, but it was definitely Wednesday. But if you enjoyed this discussion, if you like this and would like it to continue, I know it was a little bit. I'm going to see if I can't convince someone to like get on voice chat with me or something, because I like reading it, but in like having other people watch me read things, I don't know how much entertainment value that has. But we'll see what happens in the future. But if you enjoyed this discussion, if you enjoyed this series, I do have a Venmo, and I appreciate any donations or any support that you can provide, because Corona. Okay. Because that helps me figure out how effective I am being and what you guys like and what you guys don't like. And I appreciate any support. So I will see you guys on Sunday. And until then, have a good week. All right. Bye.